Hello everyone. A while ago I managed to pick up an X-Pro1 with the 35mm f1.4 lens. And rumors said that this camera, and especially with this lens combination, it is something extraordinary, something heavenly, something out of this world, something that the newer cameras can't really keep up with. It's said that it renders colors in an amazing way, in a more organic way, in a more softer way, in a more pleasing way. And well, if you look on internet what people said about that, they said a lot of stuff. But the thing is, there is something true to it. And that was the reason why I picked up the camera. I wanted to figure out if internet is right or if it's just hyped up and I just wasted my money on this camera. Well, spoiler alert, I didn't waste any money. And the fun thing is, nowadays when I go out and shoot, it's not so obvious which camera I should bring with me. I think we need to talk a little bit about this camera as well and some specification. It has a contrast-based autofocus, and the best thing you can do with this autofocus is basically to just leave it in the middle and focus and recompose, or maybe move it around a little bit. It's not so effective to move around, and you kind of need to press one button and then you need to press a lot of buttons to get the point wherever you want it. But it's okay. It's a 10-year-old camera, so I don't expect it to be like the newer cameras. I know what I'm getting into, and I think it's worth it. That's the whole case. It has 16 megapixel, which is more than enough. Fun thing is that if you take an image from this camera and put it side by side with a 26 megapixel X-Trans4 sensor, the difference in the size is 1344 pixels. It's not that big, so 26 megapixel, it doesn't really matter. Well, not that much, to be honest. We're gonna compare files from each of these cameras, raw files, because raw makes more sense, because when it comes to Fuji's, you could basically, there's an endless amount of configurations you could do to customize your JPEG settings. So comparing JPEGs doesn't really make sense. So we're gonna compare the Pruvia, the standard profile on each cameras in RAW, and see what the actual difference is. So let's dig into that. We're gonna keep this short because last time I compared stuffs, we kind of ended up quite long. On the right side, we have the X-Pro3, and on the left side, we have the X-Pro1. Take a look on the sky, especially, and you will notice that the sky and the blue tones on the X-Pro1 is different from the right one. The right one has slightly more magenta towards it, and it's a little bit grayer or less saturated. However, when you compare the other details, like the greens and stuff like that in the image, the difference is not that big. And an interesting thing that I noticed here, if you look on the white balance value, it says on the X-Pro3 5315, and on the X-Pro1 it says 5321, and there's also a different value on the tint. And that is, even if I put both cameras on the Kelvin as at 5300, it still makes some work by itself and decides that it should not be exactly 5300. But what happens if we are syncing up the white balance on both images? Well, not much really. The difference between the images gets a little bit bigger. I find this specific image a little bit interesting because, as I mentioned before, I didn't notice that big of a difference in the green. But if we look on the green tones specifically on this one, it's quite big, and that's quite interesting. Because if we look down on the other green tones, well, the difference is not as noticeable as it is up here in the top. Also, if you look in the reds down here in this area, we kind of see that it's there's more tones to it. It's slightly darker when it comes to the reds areas over here. I think we could say overall, or at least in the shadow, it seems like the shadow areas on the X-Pro1 is slightly darker, and there's going to come more examples on that later. There's definitely a difference in the black. The black on the X-Pro3 leans more towards the magenta, or actually it's a little bit more neutral, I would say. There's more blue in the blacks when it comes to the X-Pro1. I tried to make this image to see if there was any noticeable difference between the skin tones. My conclusion is that, well, not in this case at least. Over here on the right side, we still have the X-Pro3, and on the left side, we have the X-Pro1. What I wanted to see here is what happens with the reds. And there's also quite a lot of yellows, and there's a lot of greens. Well, not so much, actually. It's pretty similar. And this is even if the white balance value is slightly different. Here we have a low light situation. And what's interesting with this is if we look on the values, we can see that all settings are the same. However, the X-Pro3 seems to open up the shadow and give you a slightly brighter image. That could explain the difference we saw before in the tiles on these two images. This seems to lean more towards the shadows rather than the other parts of the image. Back and forth, we clearly see that overall the image from the X-Pro1 in this case is darker, even in the brighter parts of the image, which probably in this case goes more up towards the mid-tones and not really the bright and the highlights. These two images are also quite interesting because pay attention to the area, the white area, and the garage, which is blue-gray, and the concrete over here. It's a gray color that leans towards the blue. And over here, if we will jump back and forth, X-Pro1, X-Pro3, we kind of see that the difference is quite noticeable. Just look at this. We clearly see that the tone is completely different. My last thought was like, okay, is there any difference in how much details the camera are able to produce? Because when I did my tests, I in some cases thought that, okay, it seems like the 16 megapixel sensor has more details in it. And then I was also thinking, but 26 megapixels should have more details. So to eliminate the possibilities of human error, focus being in different places, I made these two images. And before we start to look on the details in these two images, just paying attention to how it renders the colors in the sofa. And in this case, we have the X-Pro1 in the top and the X-Pro3 in the bottom. While the colors on the speaker is quite similar, the colors on the sofa is completely different. But let's jump into the details, and the conclusion we can come up with here is that there's a lot of details in both images. And I would not say that anyone is sharper or richer in details than the other one. What conclusions can we take? Should you sell your X-Pro3 and buy an X-Pro1 instead? Should you pick up the X-Pro1 instead of the X-Pro3? Well, pick up both. And if budget is a very limiting factor, you're not going to get disappointed by the X-Pro1. However, there is a huge compromise when it comes to pure performance, but when it comes to image quality, I would say that there's not any compromises. There's things I like with the X-Pro1 and there's things that I like with the X-Pro3. When I picked up this camera, my thought was that, okay, I'm gonna do this review and then I'm gonna sell it. But honestly, I'm not so sure if I want to sell this. It's quite pleasing to shoot with it. I enjoy using it. And it's quite cheap, so I feel like I don't have to be afraid of maybe losing it, dropping it, and stuff like that. Which is a nice thing to feel with a camera, because it makes you using the camera in a different way than you might do with a more expensive one. However, the X-Pro3, it's such a joy to use it. The face detection is in the autofocus, it's spot on. It's not, this camera never fails you. It just performs and performs, and you always getting those shots. So there's, I definitely recommend anyone who's thinking about it to picking up an older camera with an X-Trans1 sensor, because there is something to it, and it's worth trying out, and it's worth having, laying at home and using occasionally. And then when you're having those situations where you doing your job, where you're doing maybe a wedding, and when you want the camera to be efficient and performs flawlessly, then this is the camera to pick up. If you like this kind of content and you want to see more content related to the oldest good and the Fujifilm X, then check out the playlist here and click here to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and if you like this kind of content, considering to giving it a thumbs up. Thanks for watching.